Welcome to the deep dive. If I asked you to think of a sacred text, like the most famous one, maybe the one almost everyone on earth has heard at least once.
Okay. Where are you going with this?
Well, chances are you might land on the Lord's Prayer. It's everywhere, right? In movies, culture.
Absolutely. It's incredibly well known. Ubiquitous, really.
But because it's so familiar, we often just glide right over it. We miss this huge, really central theological claim buried right there in the middle.
You mean the part about the kingdom?
Exactly. Our Father who art in heaven, thy kingdom come. That line.
Yes, that phrase. It's recited constantly, century after century. But you're right. It's not just a routine request, is it?
Not according to the sources we're looking at today. They argue it's actually a direct, almost political, definitely spiritual demand for a very specific kind of ruler to take charge.
And the really provocative part, the core argument from these sources, is that this prayer might not primarily be about asking for, say, the return of Christ as a human figure.
Right. Not necessarily Jesus coming back to sit on a throne.
Instead, it's potentially a plea for something much more immediate, for the direct, manifest kingship of the eternal God, the Father, the Abba, the infinite source itself.
To rule here, on earth.
Across all creation, that's
Yeah.
the implication. A call for God, the ultimate God, to actively reign.
Okay, wow. So let's definitely unpack this. We've pulled together a really fascinating stack of sources for this deep dive.
We have. And they cover a lot of ground, comparing these fundamental ideas about God, about kingship, supreme authority, and even time itself.
Yeah, we're looking across Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and also Sanatan Dharma, what many people know as Hinduism.
And this isn't going to be just a surface-level comparison, This tradition says X, that one says Y. We're really getting into some intense philosophical critiques here.
Absolutely. Stuff that questions divine omnipotence, for example. Can God really do anything? And even some very serious claims we need to handle carefully.
Claims about spiritual tyranny, ideological control within religious systems.
Exactly. Those are in the mix, and we need to present them impartially, alongside the counter-arguments, of course.
Of course. But beneath all that critique, our mission really is to dig down to this universal hope, this thread that seems to run through all these diverse, sometimes conflicting traditions.
You mean the yearning for a better age?
Precisely. That profound longing for what some call the age of abundance, or the Satya Yuga in Hinduism, or what Christians call the kingdom of heaven. It's this idea of a restored world.
But the critical thing is they have vastly different ideas about who that supreme king is.
Completely different definitions, yes. And perhaps even more critically, very different maps for how we get there. How do we actually achieve that global peace and divine order? The paths diverge significantly.
So the big picture question, the one we're really focusing on today, is this. What actually happens when humanity, collectively or individually, prays thy kingdom come? What does it mean to ask for God's rule?
And how do these clashing understandings of who God is, or what that supreme being is like, ultimately shape our expectations? And maybe even the destiny of the world?
We're going on quite a journey then. From the intimacy of a single prayer,
to the massive philosophical paradoxes of infinite power,
through these huge, grand cycles of cosmic time,
and landing right in the middle of modern geopolitical tensions and end times prophecies.
Okay, let's dive in. All right, so part one. Let's start where the prayer starts, the beginning. The address itself, Our Father in Heaven.
Yes. Our sources really hammer this point home. They argue that this opening phrase, just those few words, is enough to basically clarify who the prayer is directed to, and therefore who the ultimate sovereign is meant to be.
It seems simple, but the implication is huge.
It really is. The address is explicitly, unambiguously to God the Father, or Abba, that more intimate Aramaic term.
So when Jesus teaches this prayer, what role is he taking on himself?
He's positioning himself, according to this interpretation, as the mediator, the guide, what the sources call the eternal priest.
The priest who leads people to God, not the God being prayed to.
Exactly. He's the intermediary, guiding his followers towards the true, ultimate, eternal source. He's pointing away from himself, in this context, towards the infinite, not demanding that the prayer be directed inward, to him.
And you can see how that would immediately create friction with later theological developments, maybe.
Massive implications, yes. Especially when you think about those early, very heated debates in Christianity about the nature of Christ.
Like the Arian controversy.
Precisely. If Jesus teaches his followers to pray directly to Abba, the Father, as the ultimate recipient, Well, it makes things complicated for interpretations that want to say Jesus was positioning himself as the sole supreme deity right then and there.
It suggests a hierarchy, or at least a distinction in role.
It does, and the sources bring up those supporting verses, the
Yeah.
ones that were so crucial in those debates, like the line echoed in John's Gospel, "The Father is greater than I."
That single sentence caused centuries of debate, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Arius and his followers seized on it. Their argument was, look, if the Father is greater, then the Son must logically be subordinate, maybe even created. Therefore, the Son can't be the ultimate uncaused king that the prayer is addressing.
And the sources argue Jesus used that distinction deliberately.
Yes, to defer, to consistently point towards the supreme, the uncaused source. He was directing worship upward, or perhaps inward, but ultimately to the Father.
Okay, so step one established, the prayer is addressed to the Father,
Right, locked in.
which leads directly, logically, to the core petition. Thy kingdom come, thy will to be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Exactly. And if the thy refers back to the Our Father at the start,
Then the kingdom being requested, it has to be the Father's kingdom.
that's the absolute linchpin of the argument in these sources. It's a critical pivot point.
So the common interpretation, the one many people default to, oh, this is about Jesus returning as king.
That interpretation, the sources argue forcefully, might actually be missing the point. Or at least, it's not the primary meaning of this specific plea.
It's not seen as a coded request for a, human-like second coming, with Christ sitting on a physical throne in Jerusalem.
Less that, and more a direct, almost desperate plea for God, the ultimate reality, whether you call that Yahweh, Vishnu, Allah, Brahman, the Tao, the source to become the immediate, active, manifest king of earth. Right now.
Wow. So a call for the imposition of divine order directly from the source?
Yes. Not mediated through a returning human figure necessarily, but a direct manifestation of the Father's will and reign.
That reframes it quite significantly. It makes it less about a specific event, the second coming, and more about a desired state of being for the entire planet.
Exactly. It shifts the focus from who the king is in human form to what the kingdom is, this universal reign of divine justice, peace, harmony, what Sanatana Dharma calls the Dharma Raja, the reign of righteousness, or the state of being in the Satya Yuga, the age of truth.
So it's a longing for a state of cosmic alignment.
A universal yearning, you could say, which makes sense given the prayer's universal adoption.
This also brings up the distinction between roles, right? Priesthood versus kingship.
Yes, and this is vital for the theological coherence, according to the sources. How is Jesus primarily described in, say, the New Testament, especially in Hebrews?
As the high priest, Melchizedek is often mentioned.
Exactly. The eternal priest, the mediator, the one who stands between humanity and God, offering intercession, bridging the gap.
And the role of a priest is different from the role of a king.
Fundamentally different. The priest intercedes, represents, mediates. The king reigns, judges, commands.
So if Jesus is primarily fulfilling the priestly role, then asking him to simultaneously be the ultimate monarch the prayer is asking the Father to be, it creates a theological tangle, like contradiction almost.
The sources point this out, that it seems illogical.
They do. Why would Jesus teach people, okay, everyone, ask the Father to come and reign, and then the next breath effectively say, and by the way, I'm the one who's going to take that throne you're asking for? It feels inconsistent.
Especially given his consistent deference. Absolutely. Think about his own prayers, his own moments of submission, the ultimate example being in Gethsemane. Not my will, but thine be done.
He's modeling submission to the Father's authority, not claiming ultimate authority for himself in that moment.
He consistently sought the Father's reign, the Father's glory. He presented himself as the way to the Father, the perfect channel, the embodiment of the Father's will, but not the ultimate destination or the final sovereign in the context of this prayer.
So he's the facilitator of the kingdom's arrival, perhaps, but the prayer itself is directed past him.
That's the argument. He's the one teaching how to invoke the Father's reign.
When you look at it like that, the universality of the prayer really clicks, doesn't it?
It becomes incredibly powerful because if you strip away the specific Christian framing for a moment, what's the core concept? It's the supreme being, the ultimate reality.
And that concept exists everywhere.
Everywhere. Yahweh in Judaism, Vishnu or Brahman in Hinduism, Allah in Islam, Ahura Mazda in Zoroastrianism, Shangdi in ancient China, El Elyon in Canaanite traditions. The names change, the cultural expressions vary wildly.
But the underlying idea
Remains remarkably constant, the eternal, uncaused, infinite source of all that is.
And so the Lord's Prayer becomes something anyone could potentially recite sincerely.
Exactly. A Jew, a Christian, a Hindu, a Buddhist, a Muslim, anyone seeking alignment with that ultimate reality could, in theory, offer this prayer. They're asking that eternal source, by whatever name they know it, to establish divine rule, divine order.
It transcends sectarian boundaries in that sense, a timeless invocation.
Yes, and it operates on multiple levels, too. The sources emphasize this. It's not just cosmic, it's also deeply personal.
Because Jesus also said the kingdom of God is within you.
Precisely. So the prayer, thy kingdom come, on earth as it is in heaven, isn't just about transforming geopolitics or the environment. It's simultaneously a plea for the Father to reign supreme within the individual heart.
So it's about internal alignment first.
It has to be, doesn't it? It's a request to dethrone the ego, to remove the internal obstacles, the selfishness, the fear, so that the individual consciousness starts to mirror the divine consciousness.
The kingdom comes within before it can manifest without.
That seems to be the implication. The establishment of the kingdom isn't just waiting for an external event. It begins with profound personal transformation and obedience to that inner divine will. The prayer is a catalyst for that inner work.
So asking for the kingdom is asking for total personal surrender and transformation.
In essence, yes. Aligning your personal will with the divine will. Thy will be done applies just as much to my own thoughts and actions as it does to the world at large.
Okay, so to wrap up part one, the sources strongly suggest the Lord's Prayer is fundamentally a plea for the eternal Father, the supreme being known across traditions, to establish his direct reign.
Right. And Jesus, in teaching it, acts as the eternal priest, guiding humanity towards worship of this ultimate source, and, crucially, deferring his own ultimate monarchic role within the specific request of this prayer.
It sets the stage for who the real king is, the one being universally awaited, in a sense.
It lays that groundwork, yes. The focus is squarely on the Father.
Okay, let's shift gears now. We've talked about this intimate prayer for the Father's kingdom. Now we pivot to a completely different and in many ways contrasting theological landscape.
Yeah.
The Islamic doctrine of God's absolute transcendence.
Yes, Tadad. This is arguably the foundational concept in Islam. Everything else flows from it.
And Tadad means?
Absolute oneness. Utter uniqueness. God, Allah, is one, indivisible and absolutely unlike anything in creation. There is nothing comparable to him.
And this isn't just like a minor theological point. It's central.
It's the bedrock, the non-negotiable core. It functions as a kind of spiritual firewall designed to protect against the one unforgivable sin in Islam, shirk.
Which is associating partners with God. Idolatry.
Exactly. Any hint of sharing divinity, any suggestion that something created could partake in God's essential nature is shirk. And Todd is the absolute defense against that.
The sources cite specific Quranic verses that really nail this down.
They do. Two key examples. Surah 42, verse 11, which states unequivocally, there is nothing like unto him. Total incomparability.
Nothing.
At all. Nothing. And then Surah 112, Al-Ikhlas, which is incredibly concise and powerful. He begets not, nor is he begotten, and there is none co-equal or comparable unto him.
So no divine children, no concept of God becoming human. That's ruled out from the start.
Categorically ruled out.
Yeah.
And we have to understand the historical context here. This wasn't developed in a vacuum.
You mean 7th century Arabia?
Right. It was a context awash in polytheism, tribal gods, idols in the Kaaba itself. Muhammad's message of radical, uncompromising monotheism was revolutionary. It was a necessary cleansing break from that pagan environment.
Establishing God as utterly remote, utterly transcendent was crucial for that reform.
It was the core of the reform. But, and this is where the philosophical critique comes in, that necessary reformist stance arguably hardened over time into a rigid metaphysical dogma.
How so?
Because the principle of Tawhid and God's absolute difference from creation, Tanzi, led classical and modern Islamic scholarship to consistently, categorically reject any possibility of divine incarnation.
So God becoming human, like in Christianity, is just impossible within this framework.
Theologically impossible. Or the idea of an avatar descending in Hinduism. From a strict Islamic perspective, any such act would fundamentally compromise God's perfection, his uniqueness, his transcendence. It would be making God like his creation, which is forbidden.
Okay, now here comes the philosophical challenge that the sources raise. It's a big one.
It really is. The critique asks, does this absolute categorical denial saying God cannot incarnate actually end up imposing an implicit limitation on God's own omnipotence?
If God is all-powerful, shouldn't he be able to choose to manifest in human form if he wanted to?
That's the crux of the critique. If God is truly infinite, truly omnipotent, He should be capable of doing anything that doesn't involve a logical self-contradiction, like making a square circle.
And incarnation isn't necessarily a logical contradiction.
Critics argue it isn't. The voluntary act of the infinite choosing to enter, or manifest within, the finite. It's a profound choice, but not necessarily a violation of God's infinite nature. It could be seen as an exercise of his sovereign power and freedom.
The sources use some analogies to make this clearer, don't they?
They do, and they're helpful, even if they're just human-scale illustrations. Think of a great, powerful king.
Okay.
He has absolute authority, wealth, armies. Now imagine he chooses, for a specific purpose, maybe to understand his people better, to live among them in disguise for a year, working alongside them, sharing their struggles.
Does that make him less of a king?
No. In fact, you could argue it reveals a depth of character, a humility, a willingness to connect that actually amplifies his greatness when his identity was revealed. He didn't cease to be king while in disguise. He simply chose to experience a different reality.
Or the author analogy.
Right. An author creates a vast, complex, fictional world. She is the ultimate source, the god of that world. Could she write herself into the story as a character?
Sure. Happens all the time in fiction.
And does stepping into the story as Jane the Baker diminish her ultimate power as the author who controls the whole narrative? No. It's an act of creative will.
So in both cases, the act of self-limitation, of choosing to enter the finite condition,
Doesn't inherently diminish the superior power or identity.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, it can reveal qualities like humility, empathy, love, connection qualities that arguably enhance rather than detract from greatness.
And the Christian framework sees the incarnation of Christ exactly like this.
Precisely. As the ultimate expression of divine love and power, God choosing to bridge the gap, to become vulnerable, to share the human condition out of profound love and for the purpose of redemption. It's seen as the highest act of divinity, not a compromise of it.
But the Quranic theological starting point is just fundamentally different.
Completely opposed on this point. The underlying assumption is that for God to enter creation would necessarily compromise his perfection, his transcendence. It's almost like projecting a human limitation onto God, the idea that you can't be infinite and participate in the finite simultaneously.
Like saying the sun can't shine into a room without becoming less of a sun.
That's a decent analogy, yeah. Why couldn't an infinite God take on or manifest through a finite form without losing his essential infinity? The critique suggests that saying he cannot do this is imposing a human logical constraint onto the divine.
And this fundamental difference in understanding God's nature, it drastically shapes the relationship between God and humanity in each tradition, right?
Profoundly. In Islam, because of Todd and Transcendence, God is primarily understood as the absolute master Rab.
And humans.
Humans are intrinsically servants. That's the fundamental relationship, master and servant.
Which implies a hierarchy, a distance.
A necessary vertical hierarchy, yes.
Yeah.
The core attitude is submission, surrender, which is, of course, the literal meaning of the word Islam. It emphasizes obedience, awe, reverence, but maintains a certain existential distance.
The sources compare this to deism.
Somewhat, yeah.
Yeah.
It can resemble the deist idea of God as the great architect or clockmaker. He creates the universe, sets the laws, issues commands, but then stands apart from his creation. Majestic, powerful, but ultimately remote, maintaining an unbridgeable gulf.
Whereas the Christian model, with God as Father and Jesus as Emmanuel.
God with us, that embodies the opposite impulse. Intimacy, vulnerability, participation.
Yep.
God entering into the messiness of human history.
And this has huge consequences for things like salvation, right?
Massive. In the Christian view, God himself, in the person of Christ, enters the human story to suffer, die, and overcome death, thereby enacting atonement. It's an act of radical self-sacrifice by God.
Which, from the strict Islamic Todd perspective, is impossible. It's shirk.
Exactly. The remote master of the Quranic conception does not, cannot enter creation in that way. So, for the Christian, incarnation is the ultimate act of divine love. For the Islamic critique, it's the ultimate theological error. They are diametrically opposed views stemming from that initial definition of God.
Which brings us right back to that central paradox we started with.
The omnipotence question.
Yeah. By declaring absolutely that God cannot manifest as human, doesn't the theology seem to place an internal restriction on God's own will, on his power?
That's the philosophical charge. The statement, God cannot do X, is always tricky when talking about an omnipotent being. If the infinite genuinely cannot do something that isn't logically contradictory, is it still truly infinite? Or have we defined infinity in a way that limits it?
Did classical Islamic thinkers wrestle with this?
Oh, intensely. This wasn't ignored. The tension was felt, especially during the clashes between different theological schools, like the Mutazilites and the Asherites, or traditionalists.
The Mutazilites emphasized reason, right? Tried to strip away anthropomorphism.
They did. They were highly rationalistic and argued against interpreting descriptions of God having a hand or sitting on a throne, literally, as that would make God too much like his creation. The traditionalists insisted on affirming these attributes as mentioned in the Quran and Sunnah, but without delving into how God possesses them.
And this is where Bila Kaif comes in.
Exactly. Bila Kaif meaning without asking how or without modality. It became a crucial tool, particularly for the Ash'ari school, which tried to find a middle ground.
How did it work?
Essentially, it allowed theologians to affirm the attributes of God mentioned in the text like power, knowledge, life, even things like hand or face or ascending the throne, but without speculating on the manner or how, kefiyah, of these attributes.
So you affirm God has power, but you don't try to explain how his power operates using human analogies.
Precisely. You affirm he ascended the throne after creation, as the Quran says, but you don't imagine a physical body sitting on a physical chair. You accept the statement bila kaif, without asking how, asserting both God's transcendence and the textual revelation. It prevents human reason from confining God within its own limited categories.
It sounds like a way to hold seemingly contradictory ideas in tension.
It is. It's a theological bridge, a way to maintain reverence for the text while safeguarding God's absolute uniqueness.
But how does this apply to the incarnation issue? Do critics say Bila Kaif is misused here?
The critique is that, when it comes to incarnation, Bila Kaif isn't really used to hold the possibility open. Instead, the impossibility of incarnation is asserted first, based on the demands of Tawhid. Then Bila Kaif might be used implicitly to shut down further questioning about why an omnipotent God couldn't choose that path.
So instead of saying God could potentially incarnate, but we don't understand how Bila Kaif, the argument becomes God cannot incarnate because it violates Tawhid, and don't ask how this doesn't limit his omnipotence.
That's the essence of the critique. It argues that the discussion has ended prematurely. The possibility of God's omnipotence, including the choice to descend, is ruled out based on a specific interpretation of transcendence, effectively limiting God by human logic about what constitutes perfection.
And this loops back to that provocative framing we mentioned earlier, the idea of Islam being critiqued from a certain philosophical or spiritual angle as an anti-religion.
Yes, and we need to be crystal clear. This isn't saying it lacks faith or devotion. Millions find deep meaning and connection within Islam.
Right. It's a specific philosophical critique about its structure and core tenets.
The critique focuses on the implications of absolute transcendence and the master-servant relationship. If the ultimate goal of many spiritual paths is unio mystica, mystical union with the divine, becoming one with God.
Like Sufism, interestingly, which often pushes the boundaries within Islam itself.
Exactly. Sufism often strains against the confines of strict Tawhid, but the mainstream doctrine, the critique argues, by insisting the gap between master and servant, remains absolute, infinite, and unbridgeable.
Then what's the ultimate potential for the believer?
Obedience, submission, reverence, awe, perhaps even love for the master, but maybe not the possibility of achieving that intimate participatory union described in incarnational traditions, like Christianity, or non-dual traditions, like Advaita Vedanta in Hinduism.
The relationship remains defined primarily by power and distance rather than shared being or vulnerability.
That's the core of that specific critique, that the very structure, designed to protect God's uniqueness, might inadvertently flatten the spiritual landscape and limit the ultimate potential for human-divine intimacy. It prioritizes submission over union.
Okay, we've wrestled with the nature of the king, father, or master, transcendent or incarnate. Now let's shift our focus to time itself. How do these traditions see the flow of history, especially the end of one era and the start of something new?
And here, we really have to begin with the framework from Sanatana Dharma, the concept of the yugas. It offers such a vastly different perspective on time compared to the more linear Abrahamic view.
It's cyclical, right? Not just a straight line from creation to final judgment.
Exactly. It's a grand, repeating cycle of ages. Think of it like cosmic seasons. There are 4 main yugas within each great cycle, Mahayuga.
Can you quickly recap them?
Sure. You start with the Satya Yuga, the Golden Age. This is the age of truth, virtue, harmony, incredible longevity, peak human potential. Everything is aligned with Dharma, the divine order.
Sounds idyllic.
It is.
Yeah.
Then comes the Treta Yuga, the Silver Age. Virtue starts to decline slightly, maybe by a quarter. Rituals become more important. Lifespans shorten, but it's still a very righteous age. The Ramayana is often placed here.
Okay.
The Dvapara Yuga, the Bronze Age. Virtue diminishes further, maybe down to half. Strife increases. Knowledge becomes fragmented. Lifespans decrease more significantly. The Mahabharata War marks the end of this age.
And that leads us to now.
To the age we are currently living in. The Kali Yuga, the Iron Age. This is the age of darkness, conflict, ignorance, and materialism.
So according to the Puranic texts, when did this Kali Yuga begin?
The traditional dating, cited in our sources, places its beginning around 3102 BCE. This often coincides with the departure of Lord Krishna from Earth after the conclusion of the Mahabharata War.
And what are the defining characteristics of Kali Yuga?
It's pretty grim, honestly. The scriptures describe rampant moral decay, hypocrisy, greed, environmental destruction, disease, adharma, unrighteousness, chaos, falsehood becomes the norm. Truth is obscured, spiritual understanding plummets, and human lifespans become drastically shorter. People are dominated by base instincts and illusion. It is meant to. It's the bottom of the cycle, the age furthest from divine truth. And because things get so bad, it necessitates extraordinary divine intervention to essentially reset the cycle.
Ah, so the cycle does reset. Kali Yuga isn't the end of everything.
Absolutely not. That's the beauty and the hope within the Yuga system. It's cyclical. Kali Yuga is guaranteed to end. And its end isn't just destruction. It culminates in a period of intense purification and cataclysm.
Which then leads directly into the dawn of a new Satya Yuga.
Exactly. A return to the Golden Age. The slate is wiped clean, righteousness is reestablished, and the whole cycle begins anew.
And the Puranas are quite specific about how this transition happens, aren't they? It involves divine intervention.
Very specific. They describe the appearance of the final avatar of Vishnu for this current cycle. Kalki. He's prophesied to appear towards the very end of the Kali Yuga, often depicted riding a white horse, wielding a blazing sword.
What's his mission?
To destroy the wicked, eradicate the forces of adharma that have taken over the world, protect the righteous few who remain, and basically usher in the conditions necessary for the Satya Yuga to manifest again. He's the great purifier and restorer.
It's a powerful image, a necessary destruction to bring about renewal.
Yes. The end of the darkness requires a decisive intervention.
Now, what's truly fascinating and what the sources really highlight is how closely this cyclical pattern, especially the Kali Yuga, Satya Yuga transition, mirrors concepts found in biblical eschatology.
The parallels are quite striking, aren't they? Even though the overall framework, cyclical versus linear, is different.
The Bible also distinguishes sharply between two ages, doesn't it?
It does. You have this age, sometimes called this present evil age, which is characterized by sin, suffering, death, and the influence of forces opposed to God. It sounds a lot like the description of Kali Yuga.
Okay, and contrasted with that is
The age to come.
Huh.
This is the future restored state, the kingdom of God fully realized on earth. An age of righteousness, peace, eternal life, and direct communion with God. It sounds remarkably like the description of Satya Yuga.
So both traditions see our current reality as flawed, temporary, and destined to be replaced by a perfected state.
That fundamental duality, imperfect present versus perfect future, is a clear point of convergence.
And the descriptions of that future age to come in the Bible, do they line up with Satya Yuga descriptions?
Incredibly so. You mentioned the Lord's Prayer earlier. On earth as it is in heaven. That's the goal. And prophets like Isaiah give detailed pictures of what that looks like.
I remember the source mentioning Isaiah specifically, the peaceable kingdom imagery.
Yes, Isaiah 11 and 65 are key. You get these vivid images. The wolf living with the lamb, the leopard lying down with the goat, the calf and the lion feeding together. A little child leading them.
Predators and prey coexisting peacefully, no violence.
They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, Isaiah says. It's a complete transformation of the natural order, mirroring the harmony expected in Satya Yuga.
And what about human life? Satya Yuga is known for extreme longevity.
Isaiah touches on that too, quite dramatically. In Isaiah 65, describing the new heavens and new earth, it says, "No more shall there be in it an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who does not fill out his days."
Okay, longer lifespans.
But then comes the really striking part. "For the child shall die 100 years old, but the sinner being 100 years old shall be accursed."
Wait, dying at 100 will be like dying as a child, and considered a curse even.
That's the implication. It suggests that the normal, expected lifespan in that restored age will be vastly longer, perhaps hundreds or even thousands of years, just like the scriptures describe for Satya Yuga. Dying at what we consider a ripe old age now would be seen as tragically premature, possibly a sign of spiritual lack.
Wow, that specific detail. It really bridges the descriptions across traditions, doesn't it? The level of restoration is profound: life, nature, morality.
It's the essence of the promised golden age, whether you call it Satya Yuga or the age to come. A total renewal.
This transition isn't peaceful, is it? Neither tradition seems to suggest we just drift smoothly into the golden age.
Definitely not. Across the board, both in Sanatana Dharma's epics and Abrahamic prophecies, this period of renewal is preceded by intense conflict. A great decisive war seems almost inevitable.
Like the Mahabharata.
Exactly. The catastrophic Kurukshetra War effectively wiped out the old order and marked the transition from Dvapara Yuga to Kali Yuga. Similarly, the Ramayana depicts a major war against evil forces led by Ravana to restore Dharma in the Treta Yuga. Conflict is often the catalyst for epical change.
It's the necessary purification, the fire that brings away the dross before the gold can emerge.
That seems to be the pattern. And our sources argue that this expectation of a final, decisive, world-altering conflict is shared by modern end-times prophecies across these traditions, too.
We mentioned Kalki already, his role as a warrior destroying Adharma.
Yes. Then you have the Christian prophecy of Armageddon, the final great battle between the forces of Christ and Antichrist.
And in Islam.
There are various prophecies about end-times battles, including specific locations mentioned, like the battle at Dabiq in Syria, foreseen as a major confrontation between Muslim armies and their enemies before the final hour.
So everyone seems to be expecting a major clash before peace can reign.
It appears so, which leads to a very pragmatic, if sobering, conclusion drawn by the source material about how to actually achieve peace if this conflict is unavoidable.
What's the thinking there?
If the transition requires this cleansing war, then the swiftest path to the subsequent peace, the path that minimizes overall suffering and gets us to the Satya Yuga or Kingdom Age faster,
Is what?
is through precise, overwhelming, and decisive intervention by the forces of good, the forces of Dharma. Not a prolonged, messy struggle, but a swift, surgical, overpowering action that decisively crushes the forces of evil and Adharma.
So a quick, clean victory is paradoxically the most merciful way to end the darkness and initiate the restoration.
That's the strategic implication presented. Minimize the duration of the conflict and the casualties by ensuring that the good side has overwhelming superiority and uses it effectively to establish order immediately. That's seen as the prerequisite for the spiritual renewal to take root.
It's a heavy thought. That peace requires such a decisive, potentially violent intervention first.
It reflects the severity of the Kali Yuga's decay, perhaps. The idea that Adharma becomes so entrenched that only a divine or divinely inspired overwhelming force can dislodge it and create space for truth again.
Okay, this next section, we need to tread carefully. We're moving into some of the most intense and potentially controversial material from our sources.
Yes, this involves looking at specific, often harsh critiques leveled against aspects of Islam, particularly concerning its historical expansion and contemporary political expressions.
The sources we reviewed contain analysis that frames certain interpretations or manifestations of Islam as potentially functioning like an anti-religion. And again, we need to stress this isn't our personal view, but a perspective presented in the material we're analyzing.
Absolutely. The term itself is provocative. It doesn't necessarily mean lacking faith, but rather suggests a system that, according to these critics, might operate in ways that run counter to perceived goals of spiritual freedom or direct divine connection, potentially using control, fear, or even deception.
We have to present these claims accurately and impartially, and importantly, give equal weight and time to the historical context and the defenses offered by Islamic scholars and advocates.
Essential. Balance is key here. So let's break down the major points of critique. The first one centers on coercion. Coercion and how the faith allegedly spread historically and how it's maintained in some contexts today.
What's the historical charge?
Critics point to the early Islamic conquest and argue that expansion wasn't solely through peaceful conversion. They claim that conquered non-Muslim populations, often referred to as dhimmis, were systematically given a stark choice: convert to Islam, face death, or accept a subjugated status by paying a special tax, the jizya.
Is there textual support cited for this?
The verse most frequently cited by critics is Quran 9.29. It instructs Muslims to fight against certain groups among the people of the book, Jews and Christians, who don't adhere to specific tenets until they pay the jizya willingly while they are humbled.
Willingly while they are humbled. That phrasing is key for the critics.
It is. They interpret it as indicating a forced submission, a sign of inferior status. They also point to historical accounts from various conquered regions, Persia, North Africa, India, parts of the Byzantine Empire, citing instances of forced conversions or harsh treatment of those who refused to convert, arguing that jizya was often a tool of economic pressure designed to encourage conversion over time.
Okay, that's the critical perspective on historical expansion. What's the defense? How do Islamic scholars and historians respond?
They push back strongly on several fronts. Firstly, they emphasize Quran 2.256, which famously states, "There shall be no compulsion in acceptance of the religion." This verse is presented as the overriding principle. Genuine faith cannot be forced.
So forced conversions would violate this core principle.
According to this defense, yes. They argue that while wars of conquest certainly happen, as they did with virtually all empires of the era, the primary goal was often political expansion, not forced mass conversion. Many non-Muslim communities continue to exist and even thrive within Islamic empires for centuries.
What about the jizya then? How is that explained?
Defenders frame the jizya not as a punitive measure or a tool of humiliation, but as a standard poll tax, a payment in exchange for specific rights and protections offered by the Islamic State.
What kind of protections?
Crucially, dhimmis who paid jizya were generally exempt from compulsory military service, which was required of Muslim men. The tax was seen as their contribution towards the state's defense, which protected them as well. They were also typically allowed to practice their own religion, maintain their places of worship, and govern their internal community affairs according to their own laws.
Were there nuances to the jizya? Was it always applied the same way?
Not at all. The sources confirm historical accounts showing that the jizya rates vary significantly depending on time, place, and the specific ruler. Importantly, there were standard exemptions.
Who was exempt?
Typically, women, children, the elderly, the poor, the chronically ill, and monks or clergy were exempt from paying jizya. The burden fell primarily on able-bodied adult men of means.
And defenders argue the rate wasn't always excessive.
Some argue that in many historical contexts, the jizya was actually lighter than the various taxes, like zakat, the obligatory charity, required of Muslim citizens. So they present it as a practical, often fair, system of governance for a multi-religious empire, not simply as religious oppression.
Okay, so that addresses the historical spread. But the coercion critique also extends to maintaining the faith today, right? Specifically around apostasy.
Yes, this is a major point of contention in the modern era. Critics point to the fact that in traditional Islamic law, Sharia, apostasy, the act of a Muslim leaving Islam, is considered a severe offense.
And in some interpretations, even punishable by death.
In some classical interpretations and in the legal systems of a few modern Muslim-majority countries, like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Afghanistan under the Taliban, apostasy can indeed be a capital crime. Critics see this as the ultimate form of religious coercion, preventing people from leaving the faith through the threat of death.
How do defenders respond to the apostasy laws? This seems harder to reconcile with no compulsion in religion.
Defenders offer several arguments. Some argue that the no compulsion verse applies only to entering the religion, not to leaving it. Others argue that the death penalty for apostasy, in its historical context, was primarily applied not just for changing belief, but for acts considered treasonous when leaving Islam, also meant joining enemy forces or actively working to undermine the Muslim community or state.
So they frame it more as a political crime, like treason, rather than a purely religious one.
That's a common argument. They might claim it applies only to public renunciation, coupled with actions that harm the community, not to a private change of heart or intellectual disagreement. Some modern Islamic thinkers argue for complete freedom of conscience, suggesting the traditional rulings on apostasy are outdated or misinterpreted.
But the fact remains that these laws exist and are sometimes enforced, which fuels the critique.
It absolutely does. The existence and application of apostasy laws, even if rare compared to other offenses in some places, remain a significant point of criticism regarding religious freedom within certain Islamic contexts.
Okay, let's move to the second major critique presented in the sources, the issue of dehumanization and deception. This often starts with the term kafir.
Yes, the word kafir, often translated as infidel, unbeliever, or disbeliever, is highly charged. Critics argue that its use in the Quran and subsequent Islamic discourse serves to dehumanize non-Muslims.
How so? By portraying them as inherently lesser.
By casting them as rejectors of truth, enemies of God, and therefore potentially worthy of hostility, contempt, or subjugation. Critics claim this creates a fundamental us versus them mentality that fuels intolerance and can be used to justify violence against non-Muslims.
What's the theological defense or clarification of kafir?
Islamic scholars typically offer a more nuanced definition. They stress that kafir doesn't simply mean non-Muslim. Technically, it applies more specifically to someone who has received the clear message of Islam and then actively and consciously rejects or covers up. Kafir literally means to cover that known truth.
So it implies willful rejection, not just ignorance or following a different path sincerely.
That's the argument. It's not supposed to apply to all non-Muslims indiscriminately, particularly not to those who haven't received or understood the message, or perhaps to sincere people of the book who follow their own revelations. However, how the term is used in practice, both historically and by extremist groups today, often deviates significantly from this nuanced theological definition.
Which leads to the perception of dehumanization.
Precisely. The gap between theological definition and real-world application is often wide.
Now, what about the deception angle? The sources mention taqiyya.
Taqiyya. This is another highly controversial concept. Critics often present taqiyya as evidence of inherent dishonesty within Islam, specifically within Shia Islam, where the concept is more developed, although forms exist in Sunni thought too.
What do critics claim taqiyya allows?
They often allege it's a doctrine that permits Muslims, particularly Shia, to routinely lie about their faith or intentions, especially to non-Muslims, in order to protect themselves or advance the cause of Islam. The most extreme accusation is that it's a strategic tool for infiltration and deception, pretending friendship or moderation, until Muslims gain enough power to impose their will.
That sounds quite sinister. What is the actual definition and historical context of taqiyya?
The historical context is crucial. Taqiyya, meaning prudence, fear, caution, or dissimulation, primarily developed within Shia Islam as a protective mechanism for a minority community that faced centuries of intense persecution, often existential threats, from dominant Sunni powers.
So it was about survival.
Essentially, yes. It allowed Shia Muslims, when under direct threat of death or severe harm for their beliefs, to conceal their specific Shia identity or practices to save their lives or protect their families. It was rooted in Quranic verses that suggest allowances for uttering disbelief under duress if the heart remains firm in faith.
So it's strictly limited to situations of genuine danger, not a general license to lie.
That is the classical and mainstream understanding. It's a dispensation granted only under specific conditions of compulsion or imminent threat. It does not permit Muslims to lie freely in everyday dealings, break treaties, or engage in strategic deception for political gain.
How do defenders respond to the broader accusations then?
They dismiss them forcefully as misinterpretations or deliberate distortions, often labeling them as Islamophobic tropes designed to sow distrust and fear. They emphasize that honesty and trustworthiness are paramount virtues in Islam, and that taqiyya is a specific, limited exception for extreme circumstances, not a general rule of engagement.
So again, a gap between the technical definition and how it's sometimes perceived or misused.
A significant gap, often exploited in polemics.
This leads us to the political dimension. The sources connect these critiques to modern political realities, citing the Islamic Republic of Iran as a key example.
Yes, Iran comes up frequently in these critical analyses as a case study. Some scholars cited in our sources go so far as to label the Iranian regime, particularly its blend of theocratic rule with state power, as an epitome of Islamic fascism.
That's a very strong term, Islamic fascism. What does it entail in this context?
It suggests a combination of elements: religious absolutism, the idea that one interpretation of Islam holds infallible truth and must govern all aspects of life; ultranationalism, promoting a specific national identity intertwined with that religious ideology; militarism, suppression of dissent, often violently; and the use of state power to enforce religious and social norms.
The sources also use terms like post-fascism or Islamofascism.
Yes, these terms are used by some analysts to describe regimes or movements that they see blending totalitarian political methods with a specific, often rigid interpretation of Islamic ideology.
And the sources provide a specific contemporary example to illustrate this kind of alleged ideological tyranny.
They do. The case mentioned is the ongoing situation with former Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan, who, as of the time frame cited, October 2025, had been imprisoned for over 800 days on various charges.
How is this situation framed in this critique?
Critics, cited in the sources, view his prolonged detention and the legal cases against him not merely as standard political maneuvering, but as symptomatic of a deeper issue, a nation potentially caught in a spiritual prison.
A spiritual prison, what does that mean?
It implies an environment where political opposition, critical thinking, or attempts at reform can be stifled or delegitimized by appealing to religious sentiment or blasphemy laws, creating an atmosphere of fear and conformity that prevents genuine progress or freedom. The argument is that the system itself, built on a certain interpretation of religious authority, becomes tyrannical.
How do defenders or other analysts view the Iran situation or the Khan case? They wouldn't accept the fascist label easily, presumably.
No, definitely not. Regarding Iran, many analysts would argue the fascist label is overly simplistic and ignores the complexities of Iranian history, its anti-imperialist stance, and the internal diversity of thought, even if suppressed. They might describe it as a theocracy or an authoritarian state, but resist the specific comparison to European fascism.
And regarding Imran Khan,
Defenders of the current Pakistani establishment, or analysts critical of Khan, would argue his detention is purely about legal accountability for alleged corruption or other crimes, completely unrelated to religious tyranny. They would assert that Pakistan's judicial system, while flawed, operates within a constitutional framework, and that invoking spiritual prison is political rhetoric used by his supporters. They might also point out that Islam itself provides frameworks for justice and accountability, which they claim are being applied.
so highly contested interpretations of these events.
Extremely contested. But the core critique presented in our sources remains focused on the potential for religious ideology, when fused with state power, to become a tool for oppression and control, hindering both political and spiritual freedom.
And the ultimate conclusion drawn by these critics, it's quite striking. It's not just about political systems.
Now it goes deeper. The suggestion is that the adherents themselves, the people living under such systems, might be victims of a kind of spiritual spell or blindness, induced by fear, indoctrination, or the sheer weight of tradition.
A spell that prevents them from seeing alternatives or recognizing true spiritual freedom.
That's the implication. The argument is that this kind of ideological tyranny requires more than just political reform to be overcome. It requires a spiritual awakening, a liberation of consciousness among the people themselves. The system is seen as fundamentally antithetical to genuine spiritual clarity and the direct experience of the divine.
So, the critique circles back to the idea of distance and control. If dissent is impossible, if submission is absolute, and if the divine is presented as fundamentally remote and inaccessible, except through prescribed intermediaries or texts,
Then the argument goes, the human spiritual potential for direct knowing, for gnosis, for intimate union, is inherently limited or truncated by the system itself.
and the only ultimate solution from this perspective is not just a change in government, but the arrival of something or someone that can break that spell.
The arrival of the true king, perhaps. Someone with the spiritual authority and discernment to cut through the illusion and reveal the truth directly. That seems to be where the critique ultimately leads.
All right, following that intense critique, the sources shift perspective again, introducing this rather interesting metaphor for the relationship between different world religions.
Yes, the educational hierarchy metaphor. It's definitely thought-provoking, though potentially controversial too.
How does it lay things out?
It posits, metaphorically of course, that some traditions might represent different levels of spiritual education. Judaism and Christianity are presented as akin to high school.
High school, meaning foundational, essential, but not the final stage.
Exactly, providing crucial foundational knowledge, monotheism, ethics, historical revelation, the concept of a personal God, salvation doctrines, absolutely vital building blocks.
And then Sanat Dharma, Hinduism, is positioned where?
As the university level, representing, in this metaphorical view, a more advanced, comprehensive, and perhaps perennial form of spirituality.
What makes it university level, according to this perspective? What's the advanced curriculum?
The sources emphasize several things. Its focus on eternal cyclical truths rather than linear historical ones, the incredibly detailed and sophisticated law of karma and reincarnation explaining cause and effect over vast timescales, its emphasis on direct experiential realization, jnana, moksha, over belief or salvation granted solely through intermediaries, and its inherent pluralism, accommodating diverse paths to the ultimate reality, Brahman.
So it deals with cosmology, metaphysics, and the mechanics of consciousness on a scale that arguably the Abrahamic faiths don't delve into quite as deeply.
That's the assertion made in this particular framing. The sheer scale of the Yuga cycles, the complex interplay of karma across lifetimes, the focus on self-realization as the ultimate goal, it presents a much broader, more intricate picture of reality.
And how does this connect to the idea of the coming age?
This framework suggests that the kind of consciousness and understanding prevalent in Sanatana Dharma, the university level, thinking about interconnectedness, karma, and eternal cycles, is actually more aligned with the nature of reality that will become apparent during the upcoming Satya Yuga, the Golden Age.
So humanity is sort of graduating from high school to university as we transition from Kali Yuga to Satya Yuga.
That's the implication of the metaphor. The shift requires a more mature, comprehensive spiritual understanding.
Okay, it's a compelling metaphor, even if people might debate the specific rankings. But the key point is that regardless of where each tradition fits on this spectrum,
They almost all share this powerful, convergent expectation, a waiting, a longing.
for the arrival of a specific figure.
Yes, an awaited king or Messiah or avatar who will fulfill prophecy and inaugurate that new age of peace and righteousness. The expectation is remarkably consistent, even if the details differ.
Let's recap those expectations quickly. For Jewish tradition,
The longing is for the Mashiach, Messiah, traditionally understood as a human leader, a descendant of King David, not divine but uniquely righteous and empowered by God,
and his role.
to redeem Israel from exile, gather the Jewish people back to the land of Israel, rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, defeat Israel's enemies, and usher in an era of universal peace, justice, and knowledge of God, ruling from Jerusalem. It's a very specific, historically grounded expectation.
Okay, and for Christians.
The expectation is focused on the return of Jesus Christ. But here, there's that nuance we discussed earlier. While popular thought focuses on Jesus returning as king, the prayer he taught points to the Father's kingdom.
So maybe Jesus returns as the agent or herald of the Father's direct reign. Or perhaps fulfills both roles.
Interpretations vary widely. But the core expectation is God's direct intervention to establish his kingdom, often visualized through the figure of the returning Christ, who will judge the living and the dead and reign eternally. He is seen as Yahweh incarnate, fulfilling the messianic prophecies in a divine way.
And in Sanatana Dharma.
The expectation is crystal clear. The arrival of Kalki, the 10th and final major avatar of Vishnu for this Mahayuga.
We mentioned him earlier, the warrior on the white horse.
Yes, his role is explicitly eschatological. To appear at the darkest point of the Kali Yuga, cleanse the world of rampant adharma, unrighteousness, destroy evil, protect the virtuous, and initiate the transition back to the Satya Yuga, the age of truth. He is the divine reset button.
It's striking how similar the function is, even if the identity and theology are different. A divinely empowered figure arrives to end the age of chaos and establish an age of peace.
The pattern is undeniable, and the sources even delve into some interesting, if speculative, cross-faith parallels here.
Like comparing Yahweh and Vishnu.
Yes. Pointing out shared attributes, both are seen as sustainer gods, involved in preserving cosmic order. Both have warrior aspects, intervening decisively against forces of chaos. Both are associated with divine law and righteousness. While the cosmologies are vastly different, some see functional or archetypal similarities.
And the concept of divine descent itself.
That's another major bridge. The Christian concept of incarnation, God becoming human in Jesus, finds a parallel, though not an exact equivalent, in the Hindu concept of avatara, the descent of a deity, usually Vishnu, into a worldly form to restore dharma. Both involve the divine entering the mortal realm for a specific purpose.
So the stage is set, the expectation is high across traditions, but then comes the warning.
Yes, waiting is one thing. Recognizing the awaited figure when he arrives is another entirely. And the sources warn this is where the greatest danger lies, the peril of misrecognition, potentially orchestrated by opposing forces.
Do you mean satanic forces? The sources use that language?
They do. The theological framework presented posits a conscious, intelligent adversary, often called the devil or Satan, whose primary goal is to prevent humanity from recognizing and accepting God's reign.
And what's the alleged strategy of this adversary? The sources detail it.
They outline a kind of two-pronged strategy. Strategy one is crude but effective.
Yeah.
Deny God altogether. Promote atheism, materialism, nihilism. Convince people there's nothing beyond the physical, so there's no king to wait for, no divine order to hope for.
Okay, cut people off from the source entirely.
Exactly. But strategy two is presented as far more subtle, insidious, and dangerous, especially for those who do believe in God.
What's the subtle approach?
Distortion. Allow belief in God, even encourage religious fervor, but then twist the understanding of God's nature and, crucially, misdirect the recognition.
How? By making people worship the wrong thing.
Or, more specifically relevant here, by convincing believers that the true manifestation of the divine king, the genuine incarnation or avatar when he actually appears, is actually demonic, labeling the light as darkness.
Wow, so turning the faithful against the very thing they've been praying for.
Precisely. Convincing them that the awaited Messiah or Kalki is actually the Antichrist or some evil imposter. It's the ultimate spiritual sabotage.
Do the sources offer any examples or evidence of this kind of potential infiltration or distortion within religious history?
One example mentioned, though its interpretation is complex and debated even within Islam, is the incident sometimes referred to as the Satanic verses.
Can you briefly explain that?
According to some early Islamic accounts, which are rejected by many mainstream Muslims today, there was a brief period when the Prophet Muhammad may have mistakenly recited verses acknowledging the legitimacy of certain pagan goddesses, believing these verses were part of the divine revelation. Later, these verses were supposedly abrogated, identified as a suggestion whispered by Satan, and removed from the Quran.
So even if the account is disputed, it highlights the perceived vulnerability in the process of revelation itself. That interference is considered possible.
Exactly. It demonstrates, within that specific historical narrative at least, the potential for confusion, for mistaking a false suggestion for true divine guidance, even at the prophetic level. It underscores the need for constant discernment.
Which brings us back to the universal warning. Atheism is seen as one path of deception.
A direct denial aimed at convincing people God doesn't exist, thus diverting them completely before the king even has a chance to arrive.
But the ultimate danger, the final test, happens at the moment of arrival.
Yes, when the prayers are finally answered, when the Messiah or Kalki or the agent of the Father's kingdom actually manifests, that's the critical moment. All the prophecies, all the waiting, culminates in a single choice: recognize or reject.
And succeeding in that moment requires what? Just belief.
More than belief, it requires spiritual discernment, the ability to perceive truth beyond appearances, to recognize the fundamental nature of the divine presence.
And what is that fundamental nature, according to these sources? How do you recognize the real deal?
The sources emphasize fundamental goodness. God, the true king, the true avatar, will embody love, compassion, truth, justice, humility. The divine presence, even if powerful, is rooted in benevolence.
And the devil's whispers.
The distortions, they play on fear, pride, ego, rigid interpretations, and prejudice. The sources argue that the devil's primary tool, the original sin that led to Satan's own fall, is pride.
How does pride blind people?
Especially religious leaders or those entrenched in rigid dogma pride can make them unable to recognize divinity when it appears in an unexpected form, perhaps in humility or challenging established power structures, or showing radical compassion that breaks their rules. They might reject the king because he doesn't fit their preconceived notions or threatens their authority.
So true discernment isn't just intellectual. It's rooted in the heart, in one's own spiritual goodness.
That's the conclusion. Genuine spiritual goodness, humility, and a love for truth are the only reliable defenses against deception when the divine finally arrives. You recognize goodness because you strive for it yourself.
It really is the ultimate test then. Not just if you believe the prophecies, but whether you have the clarity and purity of heart to recognize the king when he's standing right in front of you, cutting through all the potential noise and misdirection.
Can you see the light for what it is? Or will you let fear and pride convince you it's darkness? That's the final exam, according to this perspective. Hashtag Hedge Outro.
Wow. Okay, that was quite a journey. We've covered a huge amount of ground.
We really have. From digging into the specific words of a prayer millions recite daily,
All the way to these vast cosmic cycles, philosophical paradoxes, intense political critiques, and the final challenge of recognizing the divine.
But if you had to distill it, what's the one thread that really stands out, pulling through all these diverse, often conflicting perspectives?
For me, it's that universal yearning. It really struck me. Across traditions that seem, on the surface, so opposed politically or theologically.
There's this shared, deep-seated human desire for divine order to manifest here on Earth.
Yeah, whether you call it the Satya Yuga, or the Kingdom of Heaven, or the Messianic Age, it's the same fundamental hope for a world restored, peaceful, righteous.
The hope is universal. The disagreement, as we saw again and again, seems to hinge almost entirely on how God is perceived to express his majesty. What is the ultimate nature of divine power?
Is it found in absolute distance, In that uncompromising, unapproachable transcendence, the Todd that insists God remains utterly separate.
Well, is the greatest expression of majesty found in the opposite, in a radical nearness, in the intimacy, the vulnerability, the willingness to participate, the logic of incarnation, of the avatara, of God choosing to descend and engage directly.
That seems to be the core theological fault line we kept encountering. Distance versus nearness, master versus father, submission versus union.
And we traced how that fundamental choice shapes everything. How you pray, what you believe about God's power, how you interpret history and prophecy, the political structures that emerge, and ultimately what kind of relationship you can even have with the divine.
We started with the Lord's Prayer, moved to the Quranic paradox of omnipotence, explored the grand cycles of the yugas, confronted those tough critiques about coercion and fascism.
And it all led back to this critical moment of discernment, recognizing the true king amidst the confusion of the end times. The entire theological structure seems built towards that climax.
So here's something to maybe leave you, our listener, thinking about. A final provocative thought building on everything we've discussed.
If, and it's a big if based on the sources, if the greatest, most profound display of divine power isn't found in maintaining an infinite distance from creation,
but rather in the radical, almost unthinkable humility of choosing to come near, choosing to participate, even in suffering, choosing to descend.
what implications might that have for how you seek or experience God's presence in your own life right now today?
What if that very choice, the choice to descend into creation or the choice to remain absolutely transcendent and separate, is the single defining difference?
Between a theology centered on divine mastery and unquestioning submission, and one centered on divine love, participation, and the possibility of intimate union.
Mastery versus love, distance versus nearness. Maybe go explore that fork in the road for yourself.